struggle for power, or no struggles for jockeying for position or their father's approval and love. Again, arm in arm, hand in hand, this is family business. Or it's fist to fist instead of arm in arm, hand in hand. Everyone's jockeying for position, seeking their father's approval and love. Siblings are out to win at the expense of their brothers and their sisters. Everyone wants control. Everyone wants to succeed Dad. Yet Dad is not willing to cede any control, and he wants to die with his boots on. Often, the outside world, this is the image that people see. That it's one very successful family, very happy family, that the siblings and the current generation owners are able to function and work well together, and that succession planning will be a very easy process. And sometimes it is. Sometimes this image is the reality, but often the image is not the reality. And what we see behind the scenes is this type of dysfunction where the siblings are fighting for control. The founder or the current generation owners are not yet ready to give up control. And they can't quite see the image of their children taking over the business for various reasons. Often, when there's multiple siblings involved, the talent levels are different. But as parents, it's hard to see that not each and every one of my children has the same ability as I do, or the same ability as maybe another sibling does. But one of the challenges that I've run into in our line of work with succession planning is often this first image is the one that is portrayed, but a lot of times it's the one that the advisors want to see. So when we head into a succession process, we ignore some of the things that should be looked into, and we take at face value that the reality is this image that's in front of you. So I like to tell stories as a way of getting the message across. So I'm going to give you an example, and it's a real example of a very successful family business on the East Coast. Distribution business with retail storefronts, about 20 different locations. Family had enormous wealth through the real estate holdings and very profitable from an operating income standpoint. And one day I get a phone call from the CPA that represents this client, and he says, I have a potential referral for you. And let me tell you a little bit about him. The key issue that I have, or that the family has, is that there's 3 sons in the business, and they're all fighting over control. And they're all jockeying for position. And it's tearing the family apart. They're no longer spending Thanksgiving together. The holidays are a mess. Mom and Dad are very upset. And I need you to come in, and I need you to focus on how to fix the family. And it's a beautiful family, but the reality is they're all fighting. And again, I just need you to come in and fix the family. But the good news is, as I'm being told this story, we've already taken care of the succession plan. We've already addressed the estate plan. And here's what we did. We did a great job of mitigating the estate tax. The family does not really have to worry at all about the estate tax. We did some traditional estate planning strategies to make that happen. And the father, it was very important to him that the sons own the company equally, so each one of them owned the company 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. We already have the asset out of the father's estate, and they now have full ownership of the business in equal proportions. And the dad thought it was equally important that one son had this territory, another son had this territory, and another son had this territory. So Mitch, I don't need you to look at the estate plan. I just need to have you make these guys get along a little bit better. So there are lots of problems with how that thing was set up. Equal ownership, not necessarily equal talent, and they addressed it purely from an estate planning point of view. And when I heard this, I said, I can't just come in and fix the family. It's not about therapy. It's not about singing Kumbaya at the end of the day. It's about looking at the family as something that's distinct and unique. It's about looking at the management of the company, the professional management, as well as the family that's involved in the management. And it's about looking at the ownership. And where those three things come together, we have to create a holistic plan. We can't just think about one. And what happened in that example was they focused on the ownership piece exclusively and ignored the family piece, and they ignored the management, much to their detriment. So when I looked at succession, I said we've got to back up a little bit before we can try to make this better. So before I get into what I believe is a better way of addressing succession, I want to lay the foundation with some data. And I think this helps to paint some of the complexity and some of the challenges that are out there. The first one, there was a large study that was done with current generation CEOs. And by the way, I will use the term founder and current generation CEO interchangeably. So whether it's the first generation, second, or third generation, all these issues are present. They're just a little bit more complex in the founding generation. But when these owners were surveyed, only 25% of them had any confidence that the next generation had the capability, the competence, the ability to actually run the company. Yet 93% of those same respondents had all of their wealth and their income tied up in the operating business. Pretty scary to think that I have all my wealth tied up in the business and I don't have a lot of confidence that the next generation can take it over. So that has implications to succession. A little over half of those businesses have a clear vision and a clear strategic plan which has been articulated and shared throughout the family and throughout the management of the business. And only 1/3 of those businesses had any criteria whatsoever for how a family member can enter the business, other than the fact that they have the right last name. Typical things you'll see that some family businesses do, more often than not, it's by the time they get to the second or the third generation, is they set clear criteria or employment policies for how family can enter the business and what experiences they need, reporting structure, compensation, etc. So when you look at those stats, I'm not too surprised at the death rate of privately held businesses. By the time you get to the third generation, you've lost the majority of privately held businesses. And if you look at the reasons why, the majority of the reason that we have such a high death rate in the private enterprise is not due to market factors, it's due to succession planning and not doing it well and not being thoughtful and deliberate about the process. And further, when you look at those same businesses, 60% are without a succession plan. And those respondents, the average age was 58 at the time that this survey was done. So folks at, well into their 50s, and 60% do not have a succession plan at all. Well, why is that? Well, I back up and I think about what makes somebody start a company. The entrepreneurial side, the visionary side. How many businesses are started on the back of a napkin with an idea? And we had this vision to build a company and to bring in a management team to help us to grow it. They start developing a long-term strategy and planning for it. They start looking at how they can market the company. And they take on debt so they can start to grow the business. And now I have to start managing my balance sheet in a different way than I did at startup. And I start to think about how do I get liquidity from this business? How does it serve my needs after I've invested sweat and tears and taken all this risk? And now as the company grows, family starts to enter into the picture. Kids are older, they've got the ability to maybe come into the business, and instead of thinking of myself purely as an entrepreneur, I start to think of myself as a founder of a multi-generational family business. And all of a sudden, those around me, either the next generation or outside advisors, are saying you have to start thinking about your exit plan. You have to start thinking about ownership. You have to start thinking about succession. And by the way, you have to put in an estate plan to mitigate the estate tax problem. So you've got insurance advisors, you've got estate planning attorneys all coming to you, hitting you up with stuff that you'd rather not deal with. And they talk to you about governance and how we make decisions. And all of this creates this layer of complexity that makes people often delay succession, let alone the own issue of facing our own mortality and what's it look like if I'm not tied into the business. Most founders, most entrepreneurs rather spend their time on the right side of this screen on the classic things related to the business rather than some of the things that I threw up on the left-hand side around the family and around succession and around ownership. So this complexity really gets in the way of putting together a succession plan. So I said, when we look at the family, if we can understand those complexities and start to peel those apart a little bit and understand that we have to address each and every one of these, we should be able to put a much more successful succession plan in place. So when you look at this visual, in the family business at the top, there are three things that are in play. We have those things unique to the family, our values, our culture, our history, those things that make us unique as a family. Then we have ownership. How do we own the business? Is it 100% owned by one individual? What type of entity do we hold it in? Do we have multiple partners? Do we have outside investors? I don't know, but what's the ownership look like? And then we have the management of the business, the day-to-day, opening and closing the doors, getting the product in and out, marketing the business, building a management team. And when you look at succession and you look at the family business, if you look right in the center of that, if you're not looking at all three of those aspects and building a plan that takes all of those into effect, you more often than not have a bad outcome. If all you think about is ownership, that is more often than not just an estate plan that focuses on tax mitigation. If all you focus on is the management, you ignore the ownership, and what does it mean to be a good steward? What does it mean to be a good board member? What does it mean to be a strategic thinker, not just focused on the day-to-day? You're going to put in place a poorly laid out plan. So we deal right in the middle of that, and we have to look at all of those. So from a behavioral standpoint, from a management and ownership standpoint. And if you look underneath that slide that I have up there, there are all these different people that are at play when it comes to putting a succession plan. And I believe each and every one of those outside advisors, obviously along with the business owners and the family, are integral to a succession plan. But any one discipline, if it acts on its own, more often than not, you have a poor outcome. And I work hand in hand with all of these disciplines. And I'll say this when they're in the room, and I have. But an estate planning attorney looks at succession and looks at the middle arrow at the top about ownership. Same thing with the business attorney. They focus on the ownership aspect. So if I take you back to that first example I gave with the three sons in the business, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, where the business had already been passed down. What happened there was the CPA and the estate planning attorney looked at ownership and ownership alone. And they ignored management and they ignored the family. Had they focused on the management before they put the plan in place, they would have realized that two of the three sons were incompetent. And I'm not saying that lightly. They spent the majority of their time on the golf course, and that's where they continue to spend their time. The other son was really creating a lot of value. And frankly, he had the talent and the ability, or he has the talent and the ability, to run a Fortune 100 company. But he was tied in equal proportions in ownership to his two brothers that were not contributing anything in management. In fact, they were detracting from management. They were not even good family members. They were fighting with mom and dad and one another. And they weren't good stewards. But yet, we put this tax plan in place that mitigated the estate tax and ignored the management and the family. So when we're working on succession, we work hand in hand with all these folks, but we say we have to take a holistic view. And I'll get back to that example a little bit and tell you a better way to do it and where we ended up with it. But all these people are integral, but they come with their tools. And I believe all the tools need to be present, because you've heard the saying before, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if I'm an insurance advisor, I can sell you a very large insurance plan to offset estate tax. That's great. It didn't necessarily address succession. So how do we make sure we're all looking at it hand in hand? So before I get into some of the how, let me talk about 3 other aspects that come into play with succession planning. And everybody, I'm sure, has heard the phrase, the tail wagging the dog. I see a lot of this. And one of the first tails that I run into a lot is this notion about equality. That business that I described in the beginning, the father said, equality is important to me. These are my 3 sons. I want to treat each and every one of them equally because equality is the fair thing to do, which is the other tail wagging the dog. I don't believe that fairness is inherently based on equality or that equality is inherently fair. That same client, to go further on that point, one of the 3 sons was responsible for acquiring 10 new distribution points. And he did this on his own with little to no help. Actually, there was no help from the brothers. They were a detractor. They were not a helper. And he acquired these through the company, and he grew the company tremendously since his father gave up control. Yet, the compensation that was set about with the governance plan was equal. The ownership was equal. And this son was coming to me with a lot of resentment, saying, I'm working so hard in this business, I'm creating so much wealth for my family and my brothers, and yet I'm being treated the same. It's inherently unfair. The last tail that wags the dog, and I've talked about it already, is tax. And I'll use that same client as another example. We do a board of directors for them as a way to help them put their governance plan in place. And the tail wagging the dog was not only the estate tax, but it was a lot of other aspects. And this particular family was real aggressive from a tax point of view. And somehow or another, they managed to survive an audit when they did this. But they had 3 different vacation homes throughout the country that they were able to run through the business successfully. And that's great. And one of the sons was in a constant battle with his other 2 brothers over which weeks he got at one particular property down in the south. And I'm in this board meeting, and I thought I had a novel idea. I said, well, this is really simple to fix. There's plenty of money around this table. We'll just have the 2 other brothers sell their shares in the house to you, and you'll own it outright. No problem. And he said, that's great. The 2 other brothers said, great. And the CPA looked at me and was giving me the daggers with his eyes, and he said, you're going to undo a tax plan that I did. That's probably going to cost us about $300,000 in lost tax savings that I put in place as a way that we structured this. And I said, okay, well, is there a different way to get around that? Long story short, he said, not really a different way to get around that. And I looked at him and I said, it's the tail wagging the dog. This family has enormous wealth, and they're fighting over this thing. They don't care about that. And the 3 brothers looked up at the accountant and they said, well, you're right. We don't care about it. We're tired of fighting about it. We'll lose the tax benefit. Just let me get this property completely by myself. Tax, tail wagging the dog very often. So then I say, how do we go about doing this in a holistic way that takes into account some of these examples I've given? How can we develop a better plan? Well, I believe there are 6 things that we have to look at. 2 of them run in parallel throughout the entire process. And while I'm going to describe this in a rather linear way, we all know there's nothing linear about working in a family business. But if we could do it in a more systematic way and be much more deliberate about it, I believe there are 6 key things that we have to look at. 2 of them are happening all the time, 2 of them being those issues in and around the founder or the current generation owners, and those things specific to the family. And the other 4 are the business itself, the management of the business, the ownership of the business, and governance and tax. So let me get into each one of these in some more detail. When we look at the founder, there's some essential elements of the founder's plan. One being, what's my role today, and what's my role in the future, and how do I shape that to enable succession to run smoothly. What's my afterlife after the business? I've seen many, many business owners that their favorite child is the business, and they can't ever imagine stepping away from it. And they give their heart and soul to it, and they don't have many outside interest. Well, if that's the case, succession is going to be much more difficult. And it also helps to start to ask questions of ourselves, ask questions of our spouse of what's that next chapter look like for me? What are the other things I can do to give myself a purpose so I can have an orderly transition within the family business? How do I transfer power effectively? What style of management do I bring to the table? Am I highly autocratic, or am I a more participatory manager? That will all influence that transfer of power. How do I achieve financial independence from the business? Another example, a succession process that we were called in at the tail end after it was rather dysfunctional. One of the things that was impeding the ability of the father to step away from the business goes back to that stat I shared with you earlier, that 93% of the wealth is tied up in the family business. And we don't have a lot of confidence in the next generation. So this particular founder had a business that had a net worth of about $100 to $150 million. But it was all tied up in the business. And he really couldn't step away. And he was really worried that if he did step away, his ability to get the income that he was used to would be jeopardized because of the talent or lack of talent of his three sons. So one of the steps we did is, back in the days when banking was a little bit easier, we did a leverage distribution, pulled about $30 million off the balance sheet without personal guarantees. And he was able to take some liquidity off the table and realize that he was protected from financial downside because he had extracted some of the wealth from the business. And it enabled him to think more clearly about succession. And the last one, I think, is actually, frankly, the easiest one. It's a tactical decision. Is how do I eliminate estate taxes so I don't have to sell the company to pay them? Other things, what questions should I be asking myself as a founder? Do I want to pass my company to my children, and why? Who says we have to? We could do a third-party sale. Sometimes the best thing we can do is actually have an exit strategy, not a succession strategy. Sometimes the legacy is something that really should be the goal, and it's a great goal to achieve. How do I want to be remembered? Am I ready to step away from the business? Is legacy important to me? What does my spouse want for the future? Have I fulfilled my dreams, or am I not finished yet building this business? So if I'm not finished yet building this business, it's harder to step away. What hopes do I have for my children and for the company? And do I have a clear sense of where I want to be as an individual over the next 5 or 10 years? One last thing related to the founder is, what type of founder are we dealing with, or current generation CEO? And there are 4 different styles that we can look at. And one is the monarch, which has a very hard time letting go. And if I take the extreme, usually the only way you have a succession behind a monarch is you have an overthrow. And then you have the general. Let's go to return. Let's fight another battle. And if there's not a battle to fight, I'll create a battle so I can continue to be in there waging war. Or the ambassador, who retires and advises. Great from a succession process. We don't lose the institutional knowledge, the entrepreneurial spirit, the gut instinct that that individual brings. And they still come back and give their advice, but they're able to step aside. The challenge, however, though, and all of us that are parents know that when we give advice to our children, often it's not taken as advice, it's taken as you're meddling in my affairs. So it's a balancing act to how to do it well. Or the governor, they retire and they disappear. It makes for an orderly succession, but we lose that special nuance, that ability of that past generation CEO, and that's risky because sometimes we still need it to really have an orderly transition. So knowing what we have will influence the type of succession, and the monarch being the most difficult. The other ones have their own challenges, but it makes it a little bit easier. One other thing to look at, too, is on the family side. And if we ignore the family side, we're going to have a lot of challenges. So when we look at the family, we say, how do we balance the left-hand side of the screen, this paternalistic, socialistic, and I'm not making a political statement, but the socialistic side of the family, And on the right-hand side, the business, which is focused on meritocracy. And how do I balance those two? Because I believe it can't be one or the other. And where we run into challenges is if somebody spends all their time on the left-hand side of that screen, or they spend all their time on the right-hand side of the screen when they look at a family business. So let me give you some thoughts here. On the left-hand side, the family side, it's based on need. On the right, it's based on merit. One's focused on relationships. One is focused on results. What are you giving me in return? One's qualitative, one is quantitative. One's not by choice. I don't get to choose my family. One is by choice. It's an at-will relationship in both directions, from employer to employee and vice versa. One's permanent, and one is temporary. So why do I talk about this? And again, I always like to give examples, and I'm going to give you a visual here that talks about the various hats. And I could throw 10 more hats up there, but this gives us a starting point. In the family business, we're wearing all these different hats, but a lot of times we're not aware of which one we should have on when we're having some difficult conversations. Am I the dad right now, or am I the CEO? Am I the brother? Am I the owner? Which hat am I wearing? So I got a phone call once from an existing client, and he was very angry at his son. And he said, "You won't believe what my son did. He came in and he told me, 'Dad, I need you to increase my salary by $100,000 a year.'" And he was already making $250,000 a year, pretty much right out of college. And the father said, "Why?" The son said, "Well, Dad, I bought that Mercedes AMG, and I've got an expensive wife that has expensive taste, and I've gotten ahead of myself, but I know the business can afford it, and you know that sooner or later my production will reach the level that I deserve that type of pay, but I really need that additional pay." Well, the dad had multiple hats on at one time. He had a CEO hat on, he had his dad hat on, but he didn't clearly delineate between the two when he was talking to his son. He was kind of jumping back and forth. Long story short, he ultimately gave his son that money. And then he called me to complain about the fact that he had already made the decision. And he said, "What do I do?" And I said, "Well, you've already made the decision." But I said, next time, think about the family side and the business side and which hat you're wearing, and make sure you're clear when you're in a conversation which one you have on. So if you could replay that conversation with your son, I would say, "Son, I'm putting my CEO hat on. Let's talk about your compensation. We have a compensation plan in place here. It's a privately held hospital, and it's based on production of surgeons, and you're paid per the model exactly the same way as everybody else is paid. So if you want to make $100,000 more a year, what you need to do is increase your efficiency, increase your throughput, and you will make more money. And when you do that, come to me, and we'll make sure we'll make that adjustment, but don't come to me before then." He didn't do that. Or he could have put his dad hat on and said, "Son, I'm sorry you're in a lot of trouble. What can I do to help you out?" And give him some life lessons about not living above his means. So I would have said, "You're not getting paid more money because it's not the way we do it here." But then I would have put my dad hat on and said, "Son, I'm going to help you out one time, but I'm not going to take this out of the business. I'm going to take it from somewhere else, and I'm going to create a loan and make sure you pay me back." Separate the conversations. So other things related to the family. When you think about family, how many conversations are we not having that we should be having? Or how many times are we saying things to somebody else but not to the person that we should be saying it? So when you come into a succession process, we have to make sure the right things are being said to the right people, and we're getting the right issues out on the table, and the wants and the desires to put succession plans in place. Also, think about all the things that we would like to do and like to say, but we don't. So I'd fire him if he wasn't my son. If you look up at the left-hand side, he's having a little bit of fun. But often those difficult conversations with our children we're not able to have. Well, that impacts succession. Or what about the messages that we're sending to the next generation? One day all this will be yours. Thank God. The next generation sees their parents or their father struggling in the business, spending all their time there, missing sporting events, taking all this risk, coming home tired and worn out, and yet they're saying, "Son, one day all this will be yours." And often The next generation doesn't want it because of what they saw growing up. Or one of my least favorites is the sense of entitlement. Yes, Dad, I'll take an interest in the company. How does 50% sound? And if we peel back the message here, what the father was saying is, son, I'd like you to come join me in the business, learn the ropes, see if this is something you're good at, see if this is something you love, and maybe one day, you'll have an opportunity to be an owner. But because of entitlement and because of not saying things necessarily clearly, the son thinks, yeah, I'm your partner. I don't even have to earn it just because my last name is the same. Or what about those messages that we deliver where the content is pure, but the way we deliver the message is misunderstood? And this is a huge dynamic between one generation and the next generation, that often it's not what we say, it's how we say it, and things are misunderstood, and we run into conflict. So understanding the founder and the family dynamic and taking a more deliberate way, you have to understand those, but then you have to look at the business. And you have to ask questions about where is this business in its life cycle? Is this a company that is heavily founder dependent? If it is, what do I need to do to institutionalize the business, professionalize the management team to enable the business to succeed without the founder? Where are we headed from a strategic point of view? Do we have a clear sense of what our strategic direction is and the plan to get there? And how does that play into succession? So an example, another type of distribution business, a current generation CEO calls and says, I'm a second generation owner, and I had a lot of problems with the transition from my father to me, and I want to make sure I don't make the same mistake. So I want to get in front of succession plan. Can you help me out? I said, sure. What do you have in mind? He says, well, I've got two daughters, close to 30 years old, and I want to give them each 50% of the ownership, 50-50. And they're both married to very smart, capable executives at different companies. And I'll have them come in, and they can fight over the big chair. I said, well, before we do that, let's spend some time understanding the family. Let's understand the business. Let's look at these guys before you make a mistake and put something in writing and can't undo it. So what happened there was his daughters were really pushing him for a very quick succession, and they wanted control. One of the son-in-laws decided not to join. One son-in-law did, but he really wasn't a very good businessman. He was a real good analyst, but he wasn't a very good businessman. And the dad was on a path to being able to have a clear succession because the business was really successful, and then things went awry with the business. He did 2 acquisitions that didn't work well. He wasn't able to get the money from the business that he wanted to. And he started to want even more and more control because he was afraid of what he might be losing here. And it had huge implications to the succession plan because he started to look at the business really from a 20-year point of view rather than a shorter period of time where his daughters were looking at. So there was disconnect between where the business was and where he thought he was going to take the succession that had implications to it. So you need to understand where the business is and where you want it to go. So then in turn, you can build the management team that supports that business. So when thinking about the management side, if I know where the business is going and I have a clear sense of the strategic direction, we should understand that often the current management model will and must change, especially if it's the founding generation, which tends to be more autocratic. The questions to ask: do I want this business to be professionally managed? Do I want it to be managed by my family or some combination thereof? And do they have the talent and the ability to do that? Another thing that I really like people to focus on is don't tie the next generation to the business if they don't want to be a part of the business or if they're disruptive to the business. So that example I gave in the very beginning, one of the other things the father said to the CPA and the attorney was, my sons have to work in the business to be owners, and I don't want them to ever break up the business. So if any one of them leaves, they get a 40% discount off of the shares that they own. It makes it very difficult for them to actually exit the business. I believe in putting puts and calls in place as part of the governance process that gives individuals full value and spells out if they want to exit, if they want to put, or we're going to call their shares, how the valuation is determined and how the payout will occur over time so we don't run into a litigious type of situation. But give people an out. If they don't want to be in there, don't tie them to the business. Become serious about developing the next generation of leaders in management. It's a process. It doesn't just happen. Only then, after we've thought about the founder and understand the family, the business and the strategic direction, we build the management team that supports that, do I believe you should focus on ownership. And when you get to the ownership transition, if you have clarity again about those last points I talked about, now you can start to ask questions about who can own the business and how should they own it and where should control reside. And one of the things I believe in, and I just talked about this a little bit before, is separate ownership from control. A lot of estate planning mechanisms, when you do them, you're giving up control as you're giving up ownership. There are ways to do it through LLCs, et cetera, where you can retain complete and total control over the business, even if all of the ownership has been transitioned to the next generation. You can control income. You can control all things related to the business. You can sell the business, so you can put in place a good succession and estate plan, but still retain a lot of flexibility and still have a lot of options through a general manager type of provision that allows you to control that. And that's, if somebody wants to talk to me about that offline, I can go into a lot more detail. It's a little bit complex to do in this type of format, but make sure you retain control even as you distribute ownership to the next generation. Things to be asking yourself when it relates to ownership. Challenge assumptions. I have a lot of construction clients, and a lot of times there are daughters in the business, and a lot of times they're put in very traditional female roles. Well, who says that has to be the case? I've seen many that are the best leaders in the business. Challenge assumptions. Don't always think that the common things are the right things. Understand the differences between fair and equal. And I talked about that. Equal is not inherently fair. Look at their contribution. Focus on strengthening the ownership. Document and communicate your plan. I'm a big believer in being transparent. One of our clients wanted to make the decision about who was going to run the company should he pass away. And he chose one son over his daughter and over his other son, but he couldn't bring himself to actually have the conversation with the family. And I was working really, really hard with him to try to get him to do that, or to allow me to do it, because I thought they should hear it while he was still alive. And unfortunately, he got very sick, and we lost him relatively quickly, and he never said anything to the children. A couple weeks later, I had the unfortunate job of delivering the message, and the one son who wasn't given control really wanted to hear that directly from his father. He didn't want to hear it from me. It was harder to accept. He wanted to understand the reasons behind it. So don't avoid those difficult conversations. Once you have this part of it figured out, then you can start to address what I call the governance and the tax plan. The governance and tax plan make sure that you ensure retention of control, but you can distribute the ownership, and that you put in place an effective way of making decisions related to the business. Decisions related to divestiture, strategic decisions, allocation of capital, etc., distributions. Think about all the things that the next generation is going to have to face when you're not in the picture, because once you're not there, those decisions are harder to make. Further, start to practice them now. Develop a board process, bring them into the loop, and teach them how to make these decisions while you still have the ability to guide and influence them. In closing, from a best practices standpoint, meritocracy will bring lasting liquidity and legacy. We have to focus on running the business like it is a business. If we take an extreme view and think just from a paternalistic or socialistic type of way, it could lead to illiquidity and liquidation versus a legacy. Protect the golden goose that lays the golden egg. The family business is where the majority of the wealth is. We have to protect it. We have to nurture it. We have to do everything we can to possibly take care of it. This next piece is very important. The current generation must launch and support the process. I see all too often where it's the second generation or the next generation pushing for succession, and the current generation isn't ready. If they're not ready, and we don't guide them to a place of being ready, it's going to be a dysfunctional process at best. We can't over-communicate enough, and we should understand individual choices and strengths. And the best families plan at least a generation in advance. If you think founder to second is complicated, it gets more complicated as we add the cousin generation and more people come into play. And don't fall in love with your first plan. Develop a plan B. And I'll give one more example related to that. And it's a true story where we didn't develop a plan B. We ended up developing plan Z. That's how many plans it took to ultimately get to a succession plan. This was a retail chain of grocery stores. The father was very controlling, wanted to die with his boots on. 3 sons that had talent, different talents. One was very much a merchant, one was a great operator, and one was a great finance. Sounds like it would be perfect. But they couldn't get along. They couldn't work together. But the father was hell-bent on having a succession where his 3 sons worked side by side, hell-bent on it. And years of it not working, and years of the sons fighting, and many, many conversations, I looked at him and I said, let's redefine your objectives. So we did. And those objectives were, 1, I care about a legacy. I want my name to continue to be on the outside of that storefront. It's very important to me that that is part of our community. Okay, we can do that. Second part, I have a professional management team and a management company which helps to manage all of the stores. It's our secret sauce. I don't believe in management at the store level. I believe in global management at the macro level. That has to stay in place. So fine, we can do that. And I want all 3 sons in the business. So fine, we can do that. But I need to help you reshape that definition of my 3 sons in the business. To make the math easy, there were 30 stores. 1 son owned independently 10 stores. The other son owned independently the other 10, and vice versa. So they all owned their own 10 stores directly. And they entered into a very long-term operating agreement to keep the management company in place. And the fee structure and everything else was spelled out. So fine, we can do the management company. And 3, they have to trade under the existing name. It's going to be transparent to the marketplace that ownership resides with individual sons versus all of them. And he was able to go there. Felt a little bit different, but he was able to go there. And a great succession plan in closing, it's a process. Ideally, it's one that hardly anyone will notice. It's a non-event. It's an evolutionary process arising from careful planning and the artful management of expectations over a period of years. And it's not a legal or a financial transaction alone, nor is it just an insurance-funded plan. Rather, it's a process which includes all the various disciplines in concert to address the 6 plans that I talked about: founder, family, business, management, ownership, and the governance and the tax piece. Thank you.
Well,
Chad?
Thank you, Mitch. I found the time very valuable, and succession is certainly an issue that all of us need to give thought to as we ultimately want our businesses to carry value, on into the future. But if there are any questions that people have, you are muted, but I'd encourage you to type into the dialog box. We'll also give you Mitch's contact information at the close of this so you can follow up directly with him after. But if there's any question right now, feel free to just type it into your dialog box and we'll try to answer it. One question that did, oh yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, you can go ahead and read the question.
Oh, I was going to say one question that did come in from one of our listeners on here as you were talking about the kind of the feeling of entitlement that some children feel and trying to weigh that versus the strength of the business. What is the best way to reduce that feeling of entitlement and trade that off with keeping the business strong?
Well, it's very, very difficult. And often that sense of entitlement is very entrenched and started at a young age. But what we have done with clients, and keeping in mind this sense of entitlement, usually when we're seeing it is in folks that are 20 or 30 or 40 years old. But a lot of times the objectivity from the outside helps. The father talking to the son about, you're acting like you have entitlement, often they're not able to hear it. But from the outside, if examples are given, often they can see it. So let me give you an example. I talked about that son who came into his father and said, I need another $100,000. Well, this kid is the embodiment of entitlement. Okay, he thinks everything should be handed down to him, and I think he's 32 years old at this point. So I had a lot of one-on-one dialogue with him, and the first step I took was trying to help him to see in himself his behaviors that made others think he behaved with entitlement. Because at first he couldn't even see it, so he wasn't self-aware. And it's kind of like treating alcoholism. Until I can admit that I have a problem, it's pretty hard to fix it. So it took a lot of examples for him to finally start to see how he was behaving. And one of the things he was doing was he was really forcing his father quickly to step aside. And his father was nowhere near ready to step aside, nor should he. He's an extremely talented executive. So a lot of the talk for me was helping him to understand that you got to prove yourself. You need to do this. You need to take this step. You need to stay in the trenches for a while. Your day will come, but you need to be more patient. The other piece of it was, interesting enough, is we put a family meeting together because the son's sense of entitlement, he never saw his father struggle. Often the next generation has seen that period where the wealth wasn't really there until they were older. But in this case, the son never saw his father struggle. So I asked the son, I said, do you know the history of the business? And he said, I really don't. And we pulled both of them together in a room. And the father talked about how he had the opportunity to buy this business, and he had to completely mortgage his house, borrow money from others, and how he didn't take a salary for a long, long time, and how he almost went bankrupt twice. And he was going through this history and showing the ups and the downs, and he also started to share a lot of financial information, which he hadn't shared before, about how many times he had to loan money back to the business, how cash flow wasn't always strong. And the son began to start to understand that this doesn't just happen overnight. It's not like winning the lottery, that it's a gift. It's complex, and there are a lot of things that have to come into play. But it's kind of a long-winded answer saying it's not one particular thing, but it starts with self-awareness, and it starts with having some tough conversations when you see those behaviors. And the parents need to back that up, too. It can't just be the outsiders telling them, but we have to point it out.
Mm-hmm. Another thing you mentioned that raised a question, you started talking about developing boards and having some outside influences and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on the optimal size of a board? And then also, given it's many of these are family businesses and have family members involved, the mix of having family members on the board versus non-family members?
Well, I'm going to give a broad answer because the first thing I say is it depends. And it depends on the life cycle of the business, and it depends on which generation we're in. From founder to second generation, I believe at the founding level, more often than not, the right type of board structure is not a true board of directors. It's an advisory board. Okay, so the founder has complete flexibility and a lot of autonomy, but we're putting the right people around the room to help craft the strategic direction, provide some discipline and some accountability and objective outside influence. And typically at that level of the life cycle, you see more outside advisors than you do typical outside directors. It's been my belief. But when we get to the second and third generation, or we get towards the tail end of the founding generation addressing succession, I do like to formalize the board of directors with true bylaws, true governance process, and I do like at least 3 outside directors. I really don't typically like to see more than that. And often we will put in place certain control mechanisms in the bylaws to provide for an orderly transition. So an example, I talked about the grocery stores. There was a big fear that once the father died, regardless of what the legal documents said about transition, that these 3 guys would potentially go at it and fight over the management company, try to get out of different things, et cetera. So that board of directors, we had an executive committee that was all outsiders that if they were all in unanimous agreement, they could actually make certain control decisions to make sure that these guys didn't screw things up. So long-winded way of saying, it depends. I don't like terribly large boards because I think they're ineffective. I like smaller boards, but we need to make the math work right so we don't have even numbers if it comes down to an ultimate vote. Does that answer your question, Jim?
Yeah, I think it does. I appreciate that. And then another question that came up as you were talking about the trade-off between having a meritocracy versus equality where everybody's treated the same. Let's suppose you've embraced the idea of meritocracy, that people should be rewarded based on their contribution and what they're doing and so forth. And then you have a family member who's not producing. What's the best way to go about handling a situation where the family member's not producing?
Well, being clear about which hat I'm wearing when I'm talking to you. So if we have a performance issue and we have somebody that's not contributing, one, it depends on reporting structure. Are they reporting to the owner or are they reporting to a non-family member executive? But let's take that aside. I do believe putting the right hat on and having a clear discussion and saying, look, I'm talking to you right now as the director of operations. And from a director of operations point of view, you're doing really well in this and this, but there are a couple other areas that I need you to focus on. And here's where I need you to develop. And more importantly, here are the resources that I'm going to give you to enable that to happen. It's the conversation we would have with a non-family member. And if I take it to the extreme, son, at the end of the night, come over to the house, let's have dinner. I know you had a tough day today. So how do I blend that father hat and that employer hat? I'm oversimplifying it, but the more we can do that, the better off we can ultimately be. And also, not being afraid to address often the elephant in the room. Is this the right place for them? Are they better off being somewhere else? So when I talked about that blend of the family versus the business meritocracy, and I also talked about at one point, don't always say that to be an owner I have to be involved in management. I could just be a really good owner and not be involved in management. There are different ways to take care of the need side of a family member and not disrupt the business side. So for example, if somebody is better off teaching violin, okay, to give an extreme example, and that frankly that's their core passion and their purpose. If they find a productive life outside of the business, the family can provide them a multiple of their income if they have the means to live more like the lifestyle that the family wants them to live in. So there are other ways to get money to them, but make sure that they're a contributing member and that they're living with a purpose and giving back. Answer your question, Jim?
Absolutely, yeah, I think it does. And I imagine if I were to ask the question of, what age or time period should you start thinking about succession planning, it would probably be now or sooner than later kind of answer. But somebody who's in their 40s, maybe has young kids, is going to have a vastly different mindset as they go into the succession planning versus somebody in their 60s, and it evolves over time what that succession plan likely should look like. And so the question is, what's a good rule of thumb for how often one should revisit the idea of succession planning as you age and mature and your business develops?
Well, one I would say is constant, and that's the management succession. So whether you're 40 or 50 or 60, the management side of succession, which could be non-family, it could be completely professional management team, is something we should be thinking about at all times. So a client of ours came to us and said, I'm ready to address succession. And we said, okay, let's look at the business, let's look at all the executives, et cetera. All of the executives were 60 to 62 years old. We were going to have a clip management succession all happening at one time. And there was no management death behind them. Obviously, that has a huge implication to the viability of putting a plan in place. Had they been thinking constantly, when they were 50 and 40, how do I make sure I have bench strength? How do I develop my management team? It just presents more options when it comes to succession. Second, regardless of your age, you do need to have kind of that contingency or that estate plan piece figured out. Because I have had, all too recently, a 50-year-old entrepreneur, right before we had a board meeting with them, I got a text that morning saying, can you add this to the agenda? And he got on his treadmill and he died. He had a heart attack. And the family was unprepared. They didn't know who the advisors were. They didn't really understand the estate plan. The insurance wasn't funded properly. So bad things happen. But that's kind of the bad stuff, and I consider that to be more of the estate plan side. But the management succession, I believe, should be constant. The ownership succession comes into play when you start to have clarity about what it is you want. Do you want a legacy? If you don't want a legacy and it's a liquidity event, well, let's call the investment bankers, let's do everything to increase our valuation, and let's have a third-party exit. So I don't need to think about it. It's more about exit. If I don't have children in the business, I think about it differently. But if I see children, the children have talent and have capabilities, I'm probably in my 50s at that point, and that's when I should really get serious about addressing succession. Okay?
Makes sense. Well, Mitch, I think we're going to end it there. We're right on our hour of time. I know there may be a couple other questions that we haven't answered yet, but Mitch has kindly made himself available to be able to answer any questions people may have, specific or general. And on your screen you can see both his phone number and his email address. We will be posting sending the slides out to all the people here on the call, and I've broadcasted or recorded this broadcast that we'll be sending a link to it as well if you want to share it with somebody in your team or rewatch it at a future time. So that'll all be coming out in a day or two. But Mitch, just want to say thank you for taking your time to help us all understand this important issue. And I thought it was a very clear and outstanding presentation, and I hope the members found value in it too. So
thank you
with
for your
that
time.
note, go ahead, Mitch.
I was just saying thank you for your time.
Thank you. On that note, we'll go ahead and sign off. So hope everybody has a great day. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.